The sun had barely risen over the shattered cliffs of Saipan when the stretcher teams moved across the black volcanic sand. Smoke drifted in thin, wavering lines through the humid morning air, carrying the scorched scent of a battlefield only hours quiet. Among the wounded carried from the rubble were several Japanese women officers, nurses, and administrative staff, pulled from a collapsed bunker where they had hidden through the night. Dust covered their faces. Uniform sleeves were torn. Some clutched their medical satchels as if still on duty, refusing to let go even as their strength faded. They had been taught that capture was impossible, that surrender meant worse than death. But when the stretcher halted and the figures leaning over them came into focus, a different shock rippled through them, one deeper than their wounds. The hands tending to them were large, unfamiliar, unmistakably foreign. American, male. Their breathing tightened, their eyes widened. Nothing in their training had prepared them for this moment. And yet, as the medics continued their calm, methodical work, the women realized something they could not have imagined. These men were here to save their lives. This moment opens the path to understanding how two opposing worlds collided under the harsh light of war. To understand the disbelief those women felt as American male medics leaned over them, we must step back into the world that shaped their expectations, one built on hierarchy, ritual, and an unshakable belief in the sacred duty of service to the emperor. In the 1930s, as Japan expanded across East Asia, the government mobilized not only young men for military service, but also thousands of women. Many joined the Taishintai, the Volunteer Corps. Others entered the Imperial Japanese Army Nurse Corps. Still others serve as clerks, medics, and communication staff attached to frontline units. Their training was strict, infused with both military precision and deep cultural doctrine. They were not taught to consider themselves combatants, but guardians of purity, discipline, and sacrifice. Central to this world was the concept of honor through self-denial. Women in uniform were expected to uphold ideals of modesty and spiritual strength. Surrender, especially to men, foreign men, was considered unthinkable. Manuals and lectures stressed that capture would bring shame not only to them, but to their families and to the entire military unit. The psychological barrier was immense. By 1942, as the Pacific War intensified, Japanese women found themselves drawn ever closer to the front lines. They staffed aid stations in New Guinea, hospital caves in the Philippines, and supplied depots in the Marianas. On Saipan, where the Imperial Japanese Army fortified the island against the advancing U.S. Marines, female personnel worked in underground clinics, distributing medical supplies, recording casualties, and performing first aid under constant bombardment. Their world hardened into a mix of relentless pressure and rigid devotion. But the very structure that shaped their resolve also isolated them from reality. Many believed sincerely that Allied forces killed every Japanese soldier and violated every woman who fell into their hands. These ideas were not fringe. They were repeated in official speeches, training lectures, and morale-boosting broadcasts. On Saipan, officers reminded women that death with honor was preferable to capture with shame. The mass suicides that later shocked the world were fueled by the same narrative. This ideology created a psychological armor. But armor can crack under the weight of physical collapse. By mid-1944, Japan's defensive lines in the Pacific had begun to fracture. The losses in the Solomon Islands, the collapse of supply chains, and the increasing dominance of American naval and air forces put unprecedented pressure on Japanese units. For women serving close to combat zones, the war no longer resembled the controlled, orderly mission they had been trained for. Field hospitals were overrun. Supplies vanished. Injuries mounted faster than they could be treated. On Saipan, the situation turned hopeless within days of the American landing on June 15, 1944. Marines advanced through cane fields and fortified ridges, overwhelming bunkers built into the volcanic rock. Women officers working in the underground medical stations faced not only the wounded, but constant explosions that shook the ceilings above them. Many were trapped when cave entrances collapsed. Others stayed with the injured until American forces were nearly upon them. Even in the face of encirclement, surrender was still considered forbidden. Some female personnel were issued grenades for suicide, while others were instructed to retreat deeper into the caves. Many fully expected to die. But war rarely unfolds according to doctrine. When the final defensive lines broke and small groups of women were discovered alive, many were wounded, dehydrated, or barely conscious. And when they opened their eyes, what they saw contradicted everything they had been taught. Instead of brutality, they encountered calm, organized medical procedures. Instead of danger, firm but gentle treatment. And instead of female attendants, they saw male American medics, corpsmen and nurses who had spent the previous months tending Marines in some of the harshest fighting of the war. This collision between cultural belief and battlefield reality forms the core of this story. And to understand what happened next, we must step deeper into the systems that brought Allied male medical personnel to the front lines in the first place. To grasp why Japanese women officers were so shocked when American male nurses treated them, we must examine the world that stood on the opposite side of the battlefield, one shaped by an entirely different military culture, medical tradition, and code of conduct. By 1944, the United States had developed one of the most advanced and disciplined battlefield medical systems in the world. Every Marine regiment landing on Saipan brought with it Navy corpsmen, highly trained enlisted medical specialists assigned to frontline infantry companies. They served where the fighting was thickest, crawling between foxholes under heavy fire, treating shrapnel wounds, stopping arterial bleeding, and evacuating casualties across beaches still under bombardment. Their work demanded precision and calm under unimaginable stress. Behind the front, the structure expanded. Field hospitals staffed by surgeons, nurses, male orderlies, and medical technicians operated day and night. Operating tents were illuminated only by shielded lamps. Sterilization units hissed beside rows of stretchers. Blood plasma hung from improvised stands. Within hours of a casualty arriving, the patient could receive surgery, analgesics, anti-tetanus injections, and water or plasma to combat shock. Even severe abdominal wounds or traumatic amputations had survival rates far beyond what Japanese medical services could offer in late war conditions. This system adhered strictly to the 1929 Geneva Convention, which mandated humane treatment of all prisoners of war, including enemy women. American medical officers took this seriously, not as a symbolic rule, but as a professional responsibility. Regulations required medics to treat wounded enemy personnel without discrimination, gender notwithstanding. Corpsmen were repeatedly instructed, a wounded soldier is a patient, not an enemy. For Japanese women, raised under doctrines that cast surrender as dishonor and the enemy as inherently brutal, such a system was inconceivable. Even before Saipan, Allied medical staff across the Pacific reported encounters with Japanese personnel who refused treatment, attempted suicide when approached, or begged to be left alone. American corpsmen were stunned to see nurses or clerks recoil in terror at the sight of them, believing that capture meant violation or torture. But the corpsmen understood their duty, and many took extra care to show they meant no harm, moving slowly, speaking gently, or signaling with open hands. When a U.S. assault on Saipan began, these medical rules guided every phase of the operation. Beach battalions showed remarkable discipline amid chaos. Sick and wounded men, friend or foe, were pulled from foxholes and shell craters, tagged according to injury type, and moved along evacuation routes toward rear hospitals. For Americans, this was standard procedure. Four Japanese women who had been taught that Western men were morally corrupt and violent. The behavior of these medics defied every expectation. Historical reports from Saipan mention several instances where women were found injured in caves or trenches, often dehydrated, burned, or suffering from concussion. Many wore remnants of nurse uniforms or clerical insignia. Some were unconscious when medics reached them. Others resisted treatment, covering their faces or pleading not to be touched. A few attempted to crawl away despite critical injuries. American medical staff responded by following the same protocol they used for their own wounded: stabilize breathing, check for bleeding, clean wounds, and prevent shock. The male corpsmen moving through the rubble understood the cultural sensitivity, but they had no female medical staff available in the immediate combat zones. On Saipan, American military nurses worked in rear hospitals offshore or in safer zones, far from the front line's collapsing cave network. Thus, the first person the Japanese women saw was almost always a man. This point is crucial. The shock the women expressed was not merely ideological. It was built into the structure of the battlefield. As the fighting shifted north across Saipan, American medics encountered increasing numbers of Japanese wounded left behind by retreating units. Many were women who had served in supply or communication roles, pulled into collapsing defensive lines. Their emotional reactions ranged from rigid silence to trembling fear. Some cried quietly when male medics cut away their uniform sleeves to stop bleeding, not because of pain, but because the action violated deeply rooted norms of modesty and purity. Others stared in disbelief when treated with gentleness rather than violence. For the American medical staff, this was simply another day on the job. For the Japanese women, it marked one of the most profound confrontations of the war, not with the enemy's weapons, but with the enemy's humanity. This contrast between two medical cultures, one grounded in pragmatic ethics, the other shaped by rigid wartime ideology, forms the foundation of the emotional and historical complexity ahead. And from this contrast emerge the many angles through which this story must be understood. The first angle begins not with strategy or medicine, but with culture, an invisible force more powerful than any weapon. Four Japanese women officers on Saipan, the moment of capture did not simply mean transitioning from one uniform to another. It meant confronting everything they had been trained to believe about purity, gender, and national duty. Japanese wartime ideology taught that women, especially those in military service, embodied a unique moral role. They were expected to maintain modesty, avoid physical exposure, and uphold the spiritual strength of the home front. Even as they served near combat zones, these expectations did not change. Training materials warned them repeatedly, the enemy will not respect your body or your dignity. And because male Allied soldiers were described in propaganda as coarse, predatory, and cruel, the idea of being treated physically by an enemy male was almost unbearable. This belief collided violently with battlefield necessity. When American medics cut away damaged fabric to dress a wound, or lifted a female patient onto a stretcher, the women experienced not only medical intervention, but a psychological shock. Their modesty, carefully guarded in their daily lives, seemed suddenly impossible to maintain. Some wept silently. Others froze in a kind of stunned disbelief. A few even begged the medics to leave them behind, seeing death as preferable to such exposure. Yet the American medical teams were trained to prioritize survival over cultural boundaries. In their world, an untreated wound meant death, and hesitation could cost a life. Their discipline, reinforced by the Geneva Convention and embedded in the medical ethos, demanded action. What resulted was a moment when two vastly different cultural systems collided in the most intimate of circumstances. One side acting out of duty to preserve life, the other trying to reconcile life-saving care with beliefs that framed the entire experience as impossible. This angle reveals the psychological battlefield beneath the physical one, where ideology met reality, and neither emerged unchanged. To understand the shock Japanese women felt, we must explore the second angle, the mindset of the men treating them. American corpsmen and medics were not chosen randomly. They went through rigorous technical and ethical training designed to prepare them for one of the most demanding roles in the military. They learned anatomy, emergency trauma care, battlefield triage, and evacuation procedures. But just as importantly, they were taught that their job transcended nationality. Whether a Marine, a Japanese soldier, or a civilian, any wounded person in front of them was a patient. This ethos often surprised even American infantrymen, who witnessed corpsmen crawling into fire-swept areas to pull Japanese wounded to safety. For medics, such behavior was normal. On Saipan, this ethic was tested constantly. Medics moved through destroyed villages, shattered bunkers, and smoking ravines where the fighting had ended only minutes earlier. They tended to burns, shrapnel wounds, fractures, dehydration, and infections. And when they found Japanese women, some in partial uniform, some in civilian dress but attached to military units, their training did not change. They assessed respiration, checked for shock, flushed wounds, applied field dressings, and prepared patients for evacuation. But what made the moment exceptional was not the adherence to procedure. It was the unintended humanity behind it. Many corpsmen knew that Japanese soldiers often feared them. They had seen wounded men try to take their own lives when approached. That knowledge made some medics soften their approach even further, lowering their voice, making eye contact, or offering water with a calm, steady motion. For Japanese women whose entire worldview predicted cruelty, these gentle gestures created an emotional dissonance almost as powerful as the war itself. They were confronted with the fact that the enemy they had been taught to fear was not acting like an enemy at all. And in the aftermath of battle, where the human body is fragile and ideology is thin, acts of care carried an unexpected weight. The third angle focuses on the environment in which these encounters took place. Saipan was not a control hospital ward. It was a landscape of broken coral, cratered beaches, and fractured cave systems. Treating anyone, American or Japanese, meant improvisation, speed, and a hardened ability to function under pressure. Medics treated Japanese women in places that barely qualified as medical spaces. The mouth of a collapsed tunnel, a captured trench filled with debris, a rocky ledge where supplies were limited to a canteen and a torn bandage pouch. The air was often thick with smoke. The ground still vibrated from distant artillery. The cries of wounded men and the sharp crack of small arms fire resounded intermittently across the battlefield. Under such conditions, American medics had to work fast. There was no time for embarrassment, modesty, or hesitation. If a woman was bleeding, they stopped it. If she was unconscious, they checked her airway. If her clothes were fused to her wounds, they cut the fabric. In this environment, medical care became a stark equation: survival or death. For the women, this physical urgency amplified the emotional impact. Many had never been touched by a man outside their family, and certainly never by a foreigner. In the shattered chaos of Saipan's final days, what they felt in those moments was not only fear, but disbelief. A disbelief magnified by the sheer professionalism the medics demonstrated. This angle shows that the shock Japanese women experienced did not arise merely from cultural teachings, but from the harsh, immediate reality of frontline medical care, where every second mattered and every assumption could be swept aside in an instant. The Pacific War was a theater defined by ferocity. Few conflicts in modern history produced such intense, mutual dehumanization between opposing sides. Both Japanese and American soldiers entered battle convinced the enemy was ruthless, unyielding, and incapable of mercy. Atrocities on both sides reinforced these beliefs. Yet in these rare encounters, where Japanese women were treated by American male medics, another truth emerged: the ability of individuals to act with humanity inside a system that encouraged brutality. For the medics, each rescue was not a political statement. It was a reflex built into their training and reinforced by the military's medical code. They were tasked with saving lives wherever possible, not because they expected gratitude, but because that was their duty. Some medics later recalled their shock at seeing enemy soldiers recoil from them with terror. The fear was so absolute that it felt out of place in the context of medical care. To the medics, they were simply doing what needed to be done. For the Japanese women, the moment held a different moral weight. Their training insisted that the enemy would treat them shamefully. Many expected violent death or humiliation, not rescue. So when they received professional, calm, almost gentle treatment, it cracked the moral architecture they had grown up believing. It forced a quiet internal confrontation. If the enemy is capable of mercy, what else might they be capable of? This was not a question one could ask openly, under a regime where doubt was equated with disloyalty. But internally, for those who survived, it was a moment that lingered, a painful, illuminating contradiction. War narratives tend to flatten people into symbols. But this angle reminds us that in the spaces between violence, individuals sometimes behaved in ways that defied the machinery of war itself. And for the Japanese women who lived through these moments, the discovery was as disorienting as it was life-saving. To understand why Japanese women reacted so strongly to receiving care from male medics, we must examine the perspective of the Japanese command, a perspective built not on medical realities, but on ideological necessity. Japanese military leaders feared nothing more than the psychological collapse that could accompany surrender. For them, survival after capture was dangerous. A captured soldier could become a symbol of weakness. A captured woman, especially a nurse or officer, threatened the narrative of unbroken loyalty and purity. Thus, command authorities hammered the message relentlessly. Death is preferable to surrender. Capture is dishonor. The enemy will treat you with cruelty. This messaging was not simply cultural. It was strategic. By convincing personnel that surrender was worse than death, leaders ensured that units fought to the last man, even in hopeless conditions. On islands like Saipan, this doctrine led to catastrophic human losses. It also placed tremendous psychological pressure on women assigned to medical or clerical roles. They were not expected to fight, but neither were they expected to survive capture. When American troops began taking prisoners on Saipan, men and women, Japanese leaders were horrified internally but maintained their public stance. In the months that followed, propaganda broadcasts insisted that Allied forces were torturing or executing captives, even though American records showed compliance with international law. Yet the truth was reaching Japan through other channels. Civilians and soldiers taken prisoner in earlier battles had reported unexpectedly humane treatment, but such information was suppressed, acknowledging it would undermine the central doctrine of fighting to the death. For Japanese women on Saipan, therefore, the shock of receiving compassionate medical care was not just cultural. It was evidence that something in their training had been profoundly misleading. In the ruins of a collapsed cave or a smoking bunker, the ideological wall they had trusted began to crumble. This angle highlights how wartime propaganda shaped expectations so strongly that battlefield reality felt impossible when it finally arrived. The final angle explores the aftermath, not in the strategic sense, but in the deeply personal psychological space carried by the women who survived. Survival in wartime is rarely clean. It is marked by guilt, confusion, and the uneasy weight of memory. For the Japanese women who were treated by American male medics, the shock did not fade when they reached prisoner of war camps. Instead, it evolved. Inside the camps, many realized for the first time that their lives were not in danger. They received food, medical attention, and structured routines. Some were interrogated, but within the boundaries of international regulations. Many observed American nurses working alongside doctors in the rear hospitals, something unimaginable in the Japanese system of the time. This produced a complex psychological outcome. On the one hand, surviving capture challenged everything they had been taught. Some wrestled with guilt for not having taken their own lives before surrender. Others felt ashamed they had allowed foreign men to treat their wounds, even though their survival depended on it. On the other hand, many experienced an undeniable shift, a quiet, often unspoken recognition that the world was more complicated than military doctrine allowed. Decades later, some survivors recalled the moment an American medic treated them as one of the most unexpected events of their lives, a moment that changed their understanding of the enemy, of the war, and even of themselves. This transformation was rarely celebrated. It was usually hidden, carried privately, because public acknowledgement could conflict with national narratives after the war. Yet the psychological imprint remained subtle, profound, and enduring. The afternoon sun hung low over Saipan, casting long shadows across the shattered courtyard where the nurses now sat under guard. By this point, the shock of their capture had faded into a tense, brittle silence. The battlefield noises had quieted, replaced by the distant clatter of supply trucks and the low murmur of American voices moving between makeshift aid stations. But the real shift, quiet, invisible, and profound, was happening inside the women themselves. Hours earlier, they had braced for humiliation, for cruelty, for the unspeakable fate they had been warned about since the first day of their training. Instead, they found themselves treated with the same calm professionalism given to wounded Marines. Bandages were changed. Water was offered. No one touched them unnecessarily. No one spoke harshly. The Americans kept their distance unless medical duty required otherwise. And now, as the heat of the day deepened, a new layer of realization settled over them. The enemy they had feared their entire lives did not resemble the nightmare they had been taught to expect. A medic passed by with a stretcher team, pausing only long enough to check whether one of the nurses needed her splint tightened. Another carried blankets to shield prisoners, Japanese and American alike, from the sun. The women watched all of it, struggling to reconcile these gentle actions with the brutal image of the barbaric invader etched into their minds. Something inside them began to fracture. Not their loyalty, not their identity, but the certainty of a belief they had never before questioned. This was the moment when fear began turning into something far more complex. Confusion, curiosity, and an unsettling respect. Night settled slowly over the shattered island, bringing with it a colder wind that drifted through the broken walls of the field station. Lanterns flickered between tents as American medical teams continued their work. Wounded Marines were carried in, Japanese prisoners were stabilized, and the courtyard where the women sat grew quieter with each passing hour. But inside that quiet, a decisive turning point unfolded. One of the officers, Lieutenant Nakamura, had been refusing treatment since her capture, not out of pride alone, but from an ingrained terror of what treatment by an enemy man might truly mean. She had seen the medic approach her twice, each time stepping back, as if prepared for an attack. Yet the young American corpsman kept returning, never raising his voice, never forcing her compliance, never displaying frustration. He simply knelt nearby, waiting with the bandages in his hands. By midnight, Nakamura's leg wound had begun to bleed through its original field dressing. She knew it needed attention, but every instinct hardened by military indoctrination screamed for her to resist. Still, she watched the way the Americans handled the other prisoners, Japanese soldiers, even those who had fought moments earlier, treated with the same urgency and professionalism as their own. Finally, when the pain sharpened into something unbearable, she did something she never imagined she would do. She extended her leg slightly toward the corpsman. No words, no gesture, just the smallest motion of surrender. And the medic, realizing what it meant, approached without triumph or condescension. He worked in silence, hands steady, explaining each step so she would understand. He asked permission before touching anything. He handled her wound with the cautious respect of someone repairing delicate equipment, not tending to an enemy officer. For the first time since capture, the women saw proof, not rumor, not wartime propaganda, that the Americans operated by principles they had never been taught to expect: discipline, restraint, and a strict medical ethos. By the time Nakamura's bandages were secured, the other officers were watching with wide, disbelieving eyes. This moment, the quiet acceptance of help from a man they had been trained to fear, marked the final break in the psychological wall that had defined their expectations of the outside world. In the stillness of that makeshift clinic, the women confronted a truth far more disruptive than defeat. The enemy's humanity had become undeniable. And soon, this realization would shape everything that followed. The fighting on Saipan ended days later, leaving behind a landscape both physically and emotionally scarred. For the Japanese women officers and nurses who had survived, the immediate aftermath was not just a matter of relocation. It was a confrontation with a reality their training had never prepared them for. Evacuation from the front lines began under the careful supervision of American medical teams. Corpsmen carried stretchers down smoke-streaked trails, past collapsed bunkers and burned vehicles. Women who had been trapped in caves, sustaining injuries ranging from shrapnel wounds to severe dehydration, were brought to temporary field hospitals. The camp-like facilities were basic, yet meticulously organized. Rows of stretchers, freshly boiled water, bandages, and makeshift partitions that offered some privacy. Every action remained guided by the principles of triage and humane treatment. The Japanese officers experienced the American military system in its starkest contrast to their expectations. Men who had been portrayed as merciless aggressors approached each patient with consistent discipline and professional detachment. They administered analgesics, cleaned infections, and monitored vital signs with precision. Importantly, they maintained dignity and respect, even when faced with cultural barriers. Female patients were handled carefully, personal space was observed as much as the chaotic environment allowed, and instructions were given gently, step by step. This adherence to a strict medical ethos had long-term consequences. Whereas battlefield injuries often led to permanent disability or death in the Japanese medical system, where shortages of supplies and personnel were severe, the women treated on Saipan survived in numbers that would have seemed miraculous only weeks prior. The disparity highlighted the operational efficiency and ethical discipline of the U.S. military medical corps. For the Japanese survivors, the experience was psychologically disorienting. Historical records and survivor testimonies reveal a complex mixture of relief, confusion, and lingering guilt. Relief came from having survived the fighting. Confusion stemmed from witnessing compassion from the enemy, and guilt emerged as many wrestled with the idea that surrender had been necessary for survival. The indoctrination that capture equaled dishonor did not vanish overnight. In many cases, the women internalized the experience silently, processing the contradictions in private reflections that would last for decades. At the strategic level, the capture of Japanese personnel, including women, also provided the Americans with critical intelligence. Officers and nurses carried knowledge of unit positions, defensive layouts, and supply shortages. Yet the medics' immediate responsibility remained medical, not interrogative. Ethical guidelines dictated that treatment precede questioning, an approach that further reinforced the contrast in expectations for the Japanese women. Reports from field hospitals in July 1944 document the survival and gradual stabilization of dozens of Japanese women who had been present on Saipan. Most required extended care for shock, malnutrition, and untreated injuries. Medical officers noted the unusual psychological reactions: fear tempered by awe, resistance softened by trust, and a careful observation of each American's behavior to reconcile the unexpected humanity they encountered. In the days that followed, the women were gradually moved to larger POW facilities on Guam and later to camps in Hawaii and eventually the mainland United States. Each transfer reinforced both the physical reality of survival and the emotional reality of encountering a structured, disciplined, and humane enemy. Whereas the battlefield had been chaotic, unrelenting, and terrifying, these facilities represented order, control, and the potential for life beyond immediate injury. The contrast between the battlefield indoctrination and the post-capture experience had a subtle but enduring effect. Some women maintained private diaries, noting the shock of being treated by male medics, their astonishment at the lack of cruelty, and the strange comfort of consistent care. Others later recounted in interviews how they struggled with cultural and ideological dissonance, having to reconcile deeply ingrained beliefs with lived experience. The events on Saipan and the extraordinary care provided by the medics illustrate a unique intersection of war, culture, and ethics. It was not merely a story of survival. It was a study in how professionalism, training, and adherence to humanistic principles could create moments of profound psychological impact, even in the heart of a devastating military campaign. This first stage of aftermath closes with the women alive, treated, and beginning the slow, complex journey of recovery, a journey that would continue long after Saipan's battlefields had gone silent. By late July 1944, the surviving Japanese women officers and nurses had been fully processed into prisoner-of-war facilities, first on Guam and later in Hawaii. These locations, while temporary, represented a striking departure from the chaos and terror of Saipan. Clean bedding replaced volcanic dust, cooked meals replaced scavenged rations, and medical attention replaced improvised first aid. Yet the psychological landscape remained complex, and for many, the shock of the battlefield lingered longer than the physical injuries. The women's initial interactions with American staff continued to challenge their ingrained beliefs. Male medics, surgeons, and even guards maintained professional conduct at every step. No harassment occurred. Privacy was respected as much as possible in communal spaces. For officers who had expected brutality, each measured act of discipline, each careful hand administering treatment, was a quiet revelation. Survival was no longer a battle against immediate threats. It became a confrontation with what it meant to exist in an environment governed by rules and ethics they had never imagined possible. Medical reports from this period emphasized the extensive care required. Wounds that had festered for days or weeks were cleaned, sutured, and bandaged properly. Malnourished women received nutritional support tailored to restore strength gradually. Concussions and injuries resulting from cave collapses were treated with observation and physical therapy. Remarkably, mortality rates among these survivors were far lower than in similar Japanese contexts, where lack of supplies and overburdened personnel made complications inevitable. In parallel, the psychological transformation deepened. Journal entries and post-war testimonies indicate that women officers gradually processed the incongruity of being treated with respect and competence by male members of the enemy force. For some, this manifested as a quiet, almost disbelieving gratitude. For others, it spurred reflection on the rigid military indoctrination that had shaped their expectations of cruelty. A few expressed lingering shame over having relied on enemy care, a testament to the deep-rooted cultural emphasis on honor and self-sacrifice. The broader military and historical context reinforced the extraordinary nature of these encounters. The Pacific War had long been characterized by high-intensity, close-quarters combat, where enemy treatment of prisoners was often harsh or even lethal. Japanese soldiers and civilians were accustomed to indoctrination emphasizing Allied barbarity, making any deviation from this narrative, such as humane treatment, both astonishing and difficult to internalize. The conduct of American medics on Saipan thus stood out as a rare, almost surreal exception to the pervasive brutality of the war. Operationally, the survival and humane treatment of Japanese women provided the Americans with invaluable intelligence. Officers could provide details on unit disposition, supply lines, and defensive strategies, while nurses could offer insight into medical practices and casualty rates. Yet, true to protocol, medical personnel prioritized care over interrogation. This adherence to international law, combined with effective triage, ensured that the women were treated not as instruments for information, but as human beings first. As weeks turned into months, the women began to adjust to camp life. They observed American medical techniques, hospital administration, and patient management in ways that contrasted sharply with their training under Japanese doctrine. Even the smallest details, such as the methodical documentation of patient conditions, the systematic sterilization of instruments, and the structured schedules for nutrition and hygiene, represented an entirely foreign approach. Slowly, they assimilated these practices, recognizing their efficiency and the role they played in saving lives. Ultimately, the aftermath of Saipan extended far beyond immediate survival. It forced a reevaluation of assumptions about the enemy, morality, and the very nature of warfare. For these Japanese women, the experience became an enduring lesson in the intersection of human compassion and military discipline, one that would resonate long after the guns had fallen silent. The impact of this collision between ideology and lived experience would influence their understanding of the war, their own culture, and a complex spectrum of human behavior under extreme conditions. This section closes with the women stabilized, physically recovering, and beginning the slow, profound process of internal transformation, an evolution set in motion by both battlefield necessity and the quiet professionalism of American medics.